He's 40, 1 feet up a tri-stand on the last Saturday of November. The light is almost gone, wind out of the south, and he hasn't moved in 20 minutes. 100 yards north of him, on the ridgeline, a dogman steps out of the jack pines and stops. He can count the ribs through the winter coat. He can see the way the back legs bend wrong. The head is long and the neck is too thick for it. It's close enough that he can hear it breathing. It isn't looking at him. It's looking past him, south into the cedar swamp at his back. And it's been standing like that, between the swamp and the tree he's sitting in, for almost a full minute before he figures out what he's actually seeing. Then the wind shifts. A smell rolls up out of the swamp behind him that is not deer, not bear, not anything that belongs in a Wisconsin November. The dogman lowers its head and takes 1 step backward. Hey everyone, Alex here. Before we get into it, do me a favor, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight. I read them. Thanks for being here. I want to talk about something I've been sitting on for almost 2 years, because I couldn't figure out how to say it without sounding like I'd lost the plot. A lot of you have been around this channel long enough to know I've made the case, more than once, that the dogman in the upper Midwest is an apex predator. I've argued it on camera. I've walked you through reports that pointed straight at it. I owe you an honest update. Because the longer I've looked at the Northwoods cases specifically, the more I've come around to the idea that we've been telling the wrong story about what the dogman is doing up there. 3 cases tonight, and a pattern the witnesses kept arriving at on their own, before any of us thought to stack them next to each other. By the end, I think you'll see what I saw, and no, it isn't going to make you feel better. Start with the model we've all been working off of, because I want to be fair to it. The standard dogman profile, the one Linda Godfrey did the foundational work on down in southern Wisconsin, the one the rest of us built on for 20 years, treats the dogman as a bipedal cade predator, livestock kills, roadside sightings, stalking along tree lines. The Beast of Bray Road template. I'm not here to tear any of that down. Godfrey's work is the reason this field exists in an organized form at all, and her case files out of the southern half of the state hold up. I've cited her in probably a dozen videos on this channel, and I'll keep doing it. The problem is, what happens when you take that model and try to drag it north? I mean the deep north. The Cheekimigin, Nicolet. The Bayfield Peninsula. The country up against the boundary waters on the Min-Sexanadu side. Pull the dogman reports out of that specific region, lay them next to each other, and the predation pattern comes apart in your hands. People are seeing the dogman at ridiculous close range. 20 yards. 10 yards. In one case I'll get to in a minute, close enough to smell its breath. And they are walking away. Not getting away. Not being chased off. Walking. On legs that still work. While the dogman watches them go, that is not how a predator behaves. I want to be careful here because I know how it sounds. I'm not saying the dogman is friendly. It's not a guardian spirit. It's not a misunderstood animal. It's not any of the comforting things people sometimes want these stories to be. What I'm saying is that the behavior in the reports doesn't match the model we've been using. And when guys like Joey D. Cook over at the North American Dogman Project have flagged the no aggression at close range thing in their files, nobody, me included, has done the work of actually explaining it. We just noted it and moved on. I spent about 3 weeks this past spring pulling every Northwoods Dogman report I could get my hands on. I went in fully expecting to confirm the predator model, I came out of it with something genuinely did not want to put on this channel, because it sounds insane even by the standards of what we do around here. I'm going to tell you anyway. The people who sent me their accounts deserve for me to actually say what I found, instead of burying it. 3 cases. 1 pattern. First case is the hunter from the cold open. I'm not going to give his name. He asked me not to. Bow hunter. Late 40s when it happened. Born and raised in Bayfield County. Been in those woods his whole life. November 2013. Last hour of legal shooting light. Pictures stand on the edge of a transition zone where a hardwood ridge drops into a black spruce and cedar swamp. 9 seasons in that exact stand. The Dogman came up the ridge from the north at a walk. First thing he noticed, he told me, was that the deer he'd been watching for the last half hour didn't run. They froze. All of them. Heads down, locked in place. The way whiptails do when they've already decided running is the worst option. He said that was when his stomach went cold, because he'd never seen deer make that choice before. Ever. Then the Dogman stepped into his shooting lane, 80 yards out, and stopped. He froze too. Said he did the math about the bow across his lap, and decided any movement at all was going to get him killed, so he just sat there. He expected the Dogman to look up at him. It never did. It stood in his lane facing south, into the swamp at his back, and held that position for what he first thought was 30 seconds, and later, going back over it, decided was closer to 2 full minutes. Long enough for him to study it. Long enough for him to notice that the whole body was angled toward something he couldn't see, and that whatever it was angled toward, it wasn't him. Then the wind shifted. He said the smell that came up out of that cedar swamp was the worst thing he'd ever run into in the woods, and this is a guy who has field-dressed bears that died badly. He described it as sweet and rotted at the same time. Something underneath it he couldn't name. I spent enough time with Ojibwe oral tradition on this region to recognize that description, and we're going to come back to it. It matters. The hunter didn't know any of that in 2013. He just knew the smell was wrong. It was getting stronger, and it was behind him. The Dogman lowered its head. He said it made a sound he's never been able to reproduce for anyone. A low pulse in its chest. He insists it wasn't a growl in the normal sense. He said it was a warning, but the warning wasn't aimed at him. It was aimed past him, into the swamp. And the thing in the swamp, whatever it was, heard it. He heard branches breaking in a line, moving away from his stand, deeper into the cedars, until he couldn't hear them anymore. The Dogman waited another 2 minutes. Then it turned and walked back north along the ridge, and was gone. He climbed down at full dark with a flashlight in his teeth and his bow in one hand, and walked the 1.5 miles back to his truck without stopping. He didn't hunt that stand again. Spent the next year convinced, by his own admission, that the Dogman had been hunting him and had just been interrupted by something bigger. It took a long time, and a lot of nights replaying it, before he was willing to consider the other reading. When he finally called me, 6 years after the fact, the first thing he said on the phone was, "I think I was scared of the wrong thing. Step back from the cases for a second." I have to handle this next part carefully, because I don't want to get it wrong. The Northwoods we're talking about, Bayfield country, the Boundary Waters fringe, the lake country running up into Ontario, is Ojibwe land, and the Ojibwe have been telling stories about what lives in those woods for a very long time. The story most people outside the culture have heard is the Wendigo. Cannibal spirit, ice and hunger, comes down out of the deep bush in the lean months. That's the pop version. It's not wrong, but it's thin. The fuller version, the one Basil Johnston wrote about, the one that gets passed down in winter camps, it describes the Wendigo as something specific, a thing that arrives when the food runs out and the cold sets in. Tall, gaunt, wrong smelling, patient, and there's a real historical record. The Swift Runner case in 1879 up in Alberta, a Cree man who killed and ate his own family during a winter famine and told the authorities, before he was hanged, that the Wendigo had taken him over. That's a documented event. You can read the trial records. I am not here to tell you what the Wendigo is. What I'm telling you is that people in this part of the continent have been describing the same kind of thing in the same kind of country for at least 400 years. And the descriptions are too consistent to wave off. Here's the part I've been hesitant to put on camera. In some of those same Ojibwe traditions, there are accounts of another forest being, a four-legged hunter that walks upright when it wants to, large, canid, headed, territorial. It's not the Dogman of pop cryptozoology. And I'm not going to stand here and tell you the Ojibwe were describing the Dogman, because that isn't my place and it isn't honest. What I will say is they were describing something that lived in those same woods, hunted the same prey, and kept the same enemy. The structural overlap with what modern witnesses describe, the size, the bipedal capability, the territorial behavior towards something specific in the deep bush, is striking enough that even Linda Godfrey noted it in passing in her later work, without ever fully developing it. I think she didn't develop it because she could feel where it was leading and wasn't sure she wanted to go there. I'm not sure I want to either. But here we are. The thing modern witnesses are describing, and the thing the old stories described, are keeping the same enemy. That's the part I cannot stop thinking about. Second case. This is the one that made me start taking the patterns seriously in the first place. This isn't a witness to the Dogman. This is a witness to the aftermath. She's a search and rescue volunteer. About 12 years of experience working the boundary waters fringe on the Min-Semisoya side. I'm not naming her either. She still works in that community, and she has more to lose than I do. She came to me through a researcher I trust. September 2018. Solo camper. Male, late 30s. Experienced, not somebody who got in over his head. He missed his pickup date by 2 days, and the family called it in. The SAR team found his campsite intact in a way that bothered her from the moment she walked in. Pack hung properly in the bear bag. Food untouched. Boots set neatly outside the tent flap. Stove still set up. No sign of a struggle. No sign of a bear. No sign he'd heard anything coming. The tent was zipped from the inside. About half a mile from camp, on a slow rise covered in reindeer moss, she found 2 sets of tracks. The first set she recognized right away as something she was not going to put in her official report. Bipedal. Large. Canid pad structure. Stride length that matched the Dogman tracks she'd seen in the literature but had never expected to find in person. She told me she crouched down next to that first print, and her hands started shaking, and she had to wait a full minute before she could measure it. The second set of tracks is what changed everything for her. Barefoot. Human-shaped in the sense that there were 5 toes, an arch, a heel, but the stride length was over 6 feet, and the depth of the impressions in the moss didn't match the size of the foot. She's a SAR volunteer. She's measured a lot of tracks. Whatever made those prints weighed considerably more than a person of that foot size should weigh, and was covering ground in strides no person could cover. She measured them 3 times, because she didn't believe her own numbers. The 2 track lines ran parallel for about 40 yards. Dogman on one side, barefoot on the other, moving the same direction. Then the Dogman tracks cut across the barefoot line at a sharp angle, and both sets converged in a churned patch of moss about the size of a kitchen table. No blood, no torn fabric, no body, no drag marks leading away. The tracks just stopped. The official report listed the camper as a probable drowning, body unrecovered. There was no significant water within 2 miles of the site. She kept her field notebook from that search. She's never gone public with what was actually in it. She told me she's shown it to exactly 2 people in 7 years, and I'm the second one. I've held this case back from the channel for almost 2 full years, because I couldn't figure out how to tell it without sounding like I was making it up. I'm telling you now because of the 3rd case, which is the one that finally made me write this script. 3rd case is father, mother, 2 kids, a boy and a girl, both under 12 at the time. They owned a small cabin in Iron County, Wisconsin, that the father had inherited from his own father. They went up every winter for a long weekend in February. In 2021, that long weekend turned into something else. First night, they heard something circling the cabin. The father went out at first light and found tracks in the snow that ran a complete loop around the structure, about 20 feet out from the walls. He identified them, in his own words, as wolf. But wrong. Bipedal. He'd read enough of the Dogman literature to know what he was looking at, and his first reaction was exactly what mine would have been. He loaded his rifle and told his wife to keep the kids inside. Second night, the circling happened again. Closer, maybe 15 feet out. Third night, 10 feet. He sat up all 3 nights with the rifle across his knees, lights off, curtains cracked. And he told me later that by the 3rd night, he was absolutely certain the Dogman was working up the nerve to come through a window. Then the 4th night happened. The circling stopped. He waited for it for 2 hours. It didn't come. What came instead was a sound from much farther out in the trees, well beyond the clearing, that he didn't recognize at all, and that he refused to describe to me on the recording. His wife heard it from the back bedroom and came out into the main room of the cabin with her face the color of the snow outside. She'd grown up partly on the Lac du Flambeau reservation. She'd heard that sound before, in a story her grandmother told her when she was 9 years old, and she hadn't believed the story until that moment. He said his wife sat down at the kitchen table and wouldn't speak for almost 10 minutes. When she finally did, she told him to put the rifle down. The rifle was not going to matter for what was coming. And then the Dogman track started again outside, Except this time, the Dogman wasn't circling at 20 feet, or 15, or 10. The Dogman was walking the perimeter of the cabin pressed flat against the walls, under the windows, across the porch. He could hear the weight of it on the boards. He went to the front window and looked out and saw the back of it, broad as a doorway, moving past the glass at a distance of maybe 18 inches. That, he told me, was the moment he understood. The Dogman wasn't trying to get into the cabin. The Dogman was using the cabin. It had put itself between the walls of his house and whatever was out there, in the trees making the sound his wife wouldn't repeat, and it was holding that position for the rest of the night. He sat at the kitchen table next to his wife with the rifle lowered, and the kids asleep in the back bedroom, and listened to the Dogman walk the walls of his cabin until first light. Then both the tracks and the sound were gone. They packed everything they could carry into the truck and left at sunrise. They have not been back. He told me he's going to sell the cabin without ever setting foot in it again. I asked his wife, when he finally got her on the phone 6 months after I talked to her husband, what her grandmother had told her. She wouldn't give me the story. She gave me one sentence instead, and I wrote it down in my notebook in the exact words she used, and I'm going to read it to you now, because it's the sentence that turned this whole video from a curiosity into something I had to put on the channel. She said, "The Dogman wasn't there for us. It was there for the same reason my grandmother used to leave food on the edge of the woods to keep the other thing from coming any closer. Let me pull back and lay out what I think is going on, because I've given you 3 cases, and I owe you a synthesis. Across these 3 accounts, and across a bunch of other Northwoods reports I've been through but don't have time to walk you through tonight, the Dogman shows up in close proximity to humans, most often under a very specific set of conditions. Late fall into deep winter. Deep bush, far from population centers. Country where the food has run out for the season and the cold has set in. Which is to say, the exact conditions the Ojibwe oral tradition associates with the arrival of the Wendigo, or whatever the Wendigo actually is. In those moments, the Dogman's behavior toward people isn't predatory, it's territorial. But the territory it's defending is not the woods in general, and it isn't us. It's a contested space between itself and something else, and we happen to be standing in the middle of that space. The hunter in his tryst stand was standing in it. The camper in the boundary waters was standing in it. The family in the cabin was sleeping in the middle of it for 4 nights and didn't know. I want to be real clear about what I am not saying. I'm not saying the Dogman is benevolent. I'm not saying it cares about us. I'm not saying it wouldn't kill a person under different circumstances, because there are reports out of other regions that suggest it absolutely would. What I'm saying is that in the Northwoods, in the late fall and winter, the Dogman has an enemy that is worse for us than the Dogman is. And the Dogman's enemy, and the Dogman's instinct to defend its territory line up in a way that has, more than once, kept people alive who should not be. One more thing I have to mention, because I wouldn't be doing this, honestly, if I skipped it. The SAR Volunteers Notebook from the 2018 case has never been entered into any official database. The drowning ruling for that camper was made by a sheriff's office that never visited the actual site of the tracks. I'm not going to call that a cover-up. I don't have evidence of intent. What I'm going to call it is what it is, a record that was closed before it was opened, in a part of the country where records about this kind of thing have a long history of getting closed early. Make of it what you will. So where does that leave us? It leaves me, honestly, in a worse place than where I started. The old model of the Dogman as a Northwoods predator was frightening, but it was a fear I knew how to hold. A predator you can, in theory, avoid. A predator has a profile, a pattern, a season. The model I'm describing tonight is worse, because it means there's a second thing in those woods. A thing the Dogman itself is willing to take a defensive position against, and we have almost no idea what it is. The Ojibwe have a name for it. The people who live closest to that country have been quietly leaving offerings at the edge of the trees for longer than the United States has existed. And the rest of us have spent 20 years arguing about the wrong creature. I called the hunter from the first case back last month when I was finishing the research for this video. I asked him if he'd ever gone back to that ridge. He said no, and he wasn't going to. I asked him if he still hunted at all. He said he did, just in different country, farther from the cedar swamps. And then he told me one more thing, almost as an afterthought. I'm going to leave you with it, because it's the cleanest version of what I've been trying to say for the last 40 minutes. He said sometimes, when he's sitting in a stand at last light, and the wind shifts, he catches himself listening for the Dogman, not in fear. He said he listens for it the way you listen for a neighbor you don't particularly like, but whose porch light you're glad to see on at night. That's where I'm leaving it. I'm not going to wrap this one up neatly, because it doesn't wrap up neatly. If you've had an experience in the Northwoods where the Dogman didn't behave the way the literature says it should, where it watched you and let you walk, where it put itself between you and something else, where it was there and then it wasn't, and you went home alive when you shouldn't have, please send it to me. Address is in the description. I read every one. I don't share anything without permission. If this one meant something to you, hit subscribe so the next one finds you, and let me know in the comments which of the 3 cases hit the hardest. I have my own answer, and I'm curious if it matches yours. Thanks for sticking with me on a long one. I know it wasn't the video any of us expected, me least of all. I want to end on an image instead of a thesis. It's dusk in the Northwoods. Late November. The wind is moving in the tri-line at the edge of a clearing you can't quite see across. There are 2 things in those trees tonight. One of them has been there as long as the Ojibwe have been telling stories about it, and the other one has been there at least as long as that, and probably a whole lot longer. They are not friends. They are not allies. They're just 2 old enemies who've learned to keep their distance from each other in the same country. You're standing at the edge of that clearing right now in your mind, and the question I want you to sit with isn't which one of them is real. The question is which of them is watching you, and which of them is the reason you get to walk back to your truck. Good night, everyone. Stay out of the cedar swamps after dark.